The night over Normandy was ink black, silent except for the distant moan of artillery and the metallic whisper of wind across helmets. Sergeant William Hanley crouched behind a ruined stone wall, his breath turning to mist in the cold. The men of the 29th Infantry Division had been ordered to hold the line, but the darkness made them blind. Only the faint glow of tracer fire painted brief streaks across the fields. Hanley adjusted his M1 Garand, squinting through the aperture, unable to distinguish friend from shadow. Then he did something that, by all logic, should have ruined his aim. He flipped the rear sight backwards. The first shot cracked. A spark flashed from the far hedgerow. A hit. He fired again. Same setting, another flash, another fall. The others stared, disbelieving. No one had managed that kind of accuracy all night. Private Ellison muttered, half in awe, half in fear, "He's aiming the wrong way." But the targets kept falling. Within minutes, the sergeant's unorthodox adjustment turned chaos into control. It wasn't luck. Something about the reversed sight aligned with the distorted world of night fighting, where light bent, sounds misled, and the human eye lied. When the shooting ceased, Hanley rechecked his rifle. The notch and elevation were indeed reversed. Any instructor would have scolded him for it. Yet his rounds had landed where others missed. Around him, soldiers exchanged glances. Was it a fluke or something else? The story began to spread through the platoon like wildfire. Men who had lost comrades to unseen snipers whispered that maybe there was a trick hidden in the darkness itself. By morning, his captain ordered a demonstration. Hanley repeated the setup, this time under supervision. The results were identical, perfect hits under low light. No one could explain it. Some claimed the reverse sight compensated for moonlight reflection, others for depth illusion. Hanley himself couldn't put it into words. "It just felt right," he said quietly, wiping his hands on his muddy uniform. That night, under the dim flare of signal lamps, a single line appeared in the company log. Sergeant Hanley achieved exceptional accuracy under night conditions using an unconventional sight adjustment. It sounded ordinary, but among the men who saw it, the event became legend. In a war ruled by machines, statistics, and manuals, one soldier's misalignment had somehow rewritten the rulebook. The backward setting, born of fatigue, fear, and instinct, struck truer than all the careful calculations of training. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell us, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? By late autumn 1944, Europe had turned into a maze of shadows. The forests of the Ardennes were thick with mist, and even the stars seemed to hide. American soldiers learned that night was not just darkness, it was an enemy. The Germans had perfected infiltration under low visibility, their patrols moving like ghosts through the hedgerows. Every flicker of light became a target, every spark of a cigarette a potential death sentence. Sergeant Hanley had seen what the night could do. At Omaha Beach months earlier, he had watched men fire blindly into the dark surf, their bullets vanishing into the void. Later, near St. Lo, a squad mate named Riley was shot because a shadow moved wrong. Hanley never forgot that. The silence, the single shot, the way the night swallowed the scream. Since then, he had studied how moonlight bent perception, how helmets looked like hills, how reflections on wet grass could lure the eye away from the truth. The Allied command tried to adapt. They issued star shells, luminous sights, and phosphorescent tape, but the solutions were crude. The human eye, strained for hours in darkness, could not distinguish a ridge from a man crouching. Statistics from the U.S. Army Medical Department later showed that nearly 35% of night combat casualties came from misidentified targets. Soldiers were losing lives not from lack of courage, but from the limits of human vision. In that suffocating blackness, Hanley's accidental backwards method offered a rare clarity. It wasn't just the weapon, it was a mindset. His men began experimenting quietly, one after another. They learned that the reversed sight changed the rifle's behavior ever so slightly, compensating for the deceptive angle of light at night. The shots felt heavier, slower, but more certain. A letter from Private Ellison to his fiancée, dated November 18, 1944, still survives in a faded archive box at the National Personnel Records Center. It reads, "We tried Hanley's way tonight. I don't know why it works, but it feels like seeing through fog. Maybe the world needs to be flipped sometimes to make sense." As the cold deepened, the platoon moved eastward through Belgium, still using the technique that no one dared to write into official manuals. The war had become a contest of endurance. Pilots dropped leaflets instead of bombs, and soldiers walked through towns lit only by the glow of burning fuel depots. Every night before taking watch, Hanley would kneel by his rifle, check the sight, and whisper to himself, "Backwards again." It was a ritual now. Not superstition, but defiance against blindness. In those endless nights where even faith flickered, one wrong sight became a soldier's way of seeing the unseen. And that, more than bullets or numbers, kept them alive a little longer. By the time Hanley's backwards setting began to circulate, most frontline soldiers had already stopped believing in miracles. The winter of 1944 pressed hard against them. Frozen rivers, low fuel, and nights without stars made even the best marksmen helpless. Yet somehow, one man's reversed sight started hitting targets others couldn't see. Technically, the explanation was simple, though no one realized it then. The M1 Garand sight was calibrated for daylight conditions, bright contrast, defined horizons, and visible silhouettes. But at night, light behaved differently. The darkness swallowed depth, and even the moon, when visible, created a deceptive halo around distant forms. When Hanley flipped his sight backward, he unintentionally lowered the barrel by a fraction of a degree, just enough to compensate for the optical trick caused by poor light and human misjudgment of distance. It was a paradox, a mechanical error that aligned perfectly with a human flaw. A weapons technician at the field workshop in Liège later tested Hanley's rifle, curious about the reports. In his notebook, he recorded, "Elevation reversed by 0.7 degrees, pattern tighter, shots lower, consistent, possibly optical compensation under night firing." That note, marked unofficial, was later tucked into the corner of an ordnance report. But on the ground, the men didn't need physics to understand it. They saw results. A German patrol advancing through the woods near Hürtgen was stopped cold when Hanley's unit opened fire under starlight. 12 shots, 9 confirmed hits. Lieutenant Raymond Shaw wrote in his field diary, "His rifle looks wrong, but it sings right. Even the darkness listens to him." What made it more astonishing was that Hanley himself never tried to justify it. When asked why he did it, he only said, "Because I couldn't see straight." The phrase carried more meaning than he realized. In that war, no one saw straight anymore, not through gun sights, not through orders, not even through conscience. Rumors spread across neighboring companies that the Ohio sergeant found a night trick. Men who had doubted him now copied his method. Some succeeded, some didn't. But the ones who did began to speak of the feeling, the strange calm, the connection between sight, steel, and instinct. It wasn't about calculation anymore. It was about understanding the rhythm of night itself. That backward setting defied military logic, but revealed something deeper. Every war breeds innovation from necessity, but few moments capture how chaos can give birth to precision. Hanley's discovery blurred the line between mistake and mastery, a quiet revolution forged in moonlight and fear. Long before the Army's engineers traced his backward sight to geometry and light refraction, Hanley had already sensed the truth with his fingertips. Years spent in an Ohio machine shop had taught him that precision was never purely mathematical. He could feel misalignment by the vibration through a wrench, smell friction before metal warped, and hear when a gear wasn't true. On the battlefield, those instincts replaced instruments. In December 1944, the war turned into a frozen storm. The Battle of the Bulge tore through the Ardennes like an avalanche. Snow muted every sound. Visibility dropped to nothing. Hanley's squad, now part of the defensive ring near Bastogne, found themselves surrounded by fog and static. Maps meant little. Radio signals faded. What remained was sensation, the rhythm of boots in snow, the echo of gunfire from unseen ridges, and the pulse in a man's hands as he aimed. It was there that Hanley's strange accuracy became something of a phenomenon. At distances where others fired blind, his bullets found paths through smoke and darkness. Some called it luck. Others whispered about superstition. But what he had truly done was translate feeling into science without knowing it. His mistake matched a principle that only laboratories understood. In darkness, human perception overestimates elevation. His reversed sight negated that bias. A captured German sergeant, interviewed months later, described seeing a line of fire that never missed, calling it as if the Americans could see heat itself. That statement made its way into a field intelligence memo, one of many that hinted at techniques the U.S. Army itself didn't yet comprehend. But the beauty of the discovery lay in its ordinariness. Hanley had no formal education in optics, no diagrams, no formulae. His tool was experience, the rough kind learned by those who fix engines and drive rivets. He could not explain the math, yet he felt its truth in recoil, weight, and breath. After one firefight, a fellow corporal joked, "You ought to patent that sight of yours." Hanley laughed, then replied softly, "You can't patent a feeling." That line lingered among the men, repeated like a proverb. In the war of machines, laboratories, and radar beams, it was still the human pulse that bridged error and perfection. Hanley's hands, calloused and trembling, carried more knowledge than any manual could. In his mind, the sound of the trigger and the whisper of wind through ruined trees formed an unspoken equation, one that only a survivor could solve. Word of the backward sight reached battalion command the way rumors often traveled, carried by disbelief. When the story first landed on the desk of Captain Charles McIntyre, it was dismissed as nonsense. "No soldier aims by turning a sight upside down," he scoffed. Yet reports from the front were consistent. Sergeant Hanley's men were hitting targets other units couldn't even locate. Accuracy up by nearly half, ammunition used down, morale steady despite the cold. McIntyre ordered an immediate test at a firing range near Bastogne. On January 7, 1945, under a gray sky, 2 platoons lined up. One would shoot using standard night fire instructions, the other using Hanley's reversed setting. The air was so cold that rifle bolts froze to fingers, breath turning to frost. After 30 rounds each, the results were undeniable. Hanley's group scored 41% more hits on silhouettes at 70 meters. The officers fell silent. Numbers didn't lie. A lieutenant from the ordnance section noted in his log, "Deviation reduced by approximately 1.8 inches at 50 yards under low light conditions." For the first time, data spoke louder than rank. McIntyre, skeptical but practical, finally said, "Then backwards it is." Within days, his orders spread through the 116th Regiment. In night defense, men were to adjust by Hanley's method. Still, official recognition never followed. Army bureaucracy had no column for accidental innovations. Reports phrased it in cautious language. Modified sight alignment observed effective during nocturnal operations. Further evaluation recommended. But soldiers didn't care for paperwork. They cared that the method worked, that it kept them alive. A week later, near the Siegfried Line, Hanley's squad ambushed a German patrol using the same approach. 12 rounds fired, 11 confirmed hits, no American casualties. In the after-action summary, a single sentence stood out. "Visual misperception appears corrected through reversed calibration." That phrase would quietly circulate among ordnance officers for months, buried within technical appendices no historian would read for decades. When the test ended, Hanley wasn't proud, only puzzled. "They think I discovered something," he told Ellison that night, "but I just wanted to see in the dark." Around the campfire, the men debated whether genius was ever intentional. Could one man's mistake change a doctrine, or was it all coincidence? Ellison, staring into the embers, asked, "Do you think every good thing in war starts by accident?" That question hangs in history still. And for you watching, have you ever seen a mistake turn into a breakthrough? By spring 1945, as snow melted over the wrecked forests of the Ardennes, the guns fell quieter. Germany was retreating, and with victory near, soldiers began to reflect on the strange lessons the war had taught them. Among those lessons, Hanley's backward sight became an unspoken legend, not celebrated, not denied, but carried in memory by those who had lived through the nights of blindness and fear. When captured German officers were transferred to Allied POW camps in France, stories about American marksmanship intrigued them. One camp in Chartres held several engineers from the Mauser Optics Division, men who had once designed precision sights for the Carabiner 98K and the MG42. Hearing rumors of a sergeant who improved night accuracy by reversing his sight, they asked to examine a recovered M1 Garand. Under guard, they set up their own small test, adjusting the sight as described. To their astonishment, the effect was measurable. The inverted setting reduced the overshoot common under low-light firing, a phenomenon they themselves had documented but never solved. One of them, Hauptmann Friedrich Hesse, later wrote in a confiscated notebook, "It appears the American found by instinct what we pursued by theory. He corrected the illusion of night through inversion. Perhaps genius is sometimes born from fatigue." That note was discovered by U.S. intelligence and filed under Technical Observations from POW Interrogations, Optics section. Few ever read it. Inside the camps, evenings became classrooms. German engineers lectured on parallax and luminous reticles. American guards shared field experiences. Over tin cups of weak coffee, they discussed why men see differently under moonlight, why metal seems to move in shadow. In that uneasy peace, the line between prisoner and teacher began to blur. Hanley's story traveled there too, told by soldiers rotating out from the front. Some POWs dismissed it as propaganda. Others listened with quiet respect. One German captain reportedly said, "Then perhaps the war is lost, not by weapons, but by imagination." For Hanley, now reassigned to an ordnance depot near Reims, life had grown strangely still. He missed the front's urgency, but carried the weight of what his error had become. A conversation across enemy lines. A bridge built on miscalculation. War had begun as a contest of machinery, but it was ending as a study of the human mind. In dim barracks and quiet workshops, soldiers and prisoners alike realized that survival often depended not on obedience, but on the courage to see differently. And you, if you were there, surrounded by rules, manuals, and fear, would you have dared to turn the sight the wrong way? When the war finally ended, the guns went silent, but the memories refused to rest. Sergeant William Hanley returned to Ohio in the autumn of 1945, stepping off a train that smelled of coal and victory. The brass band played for heroes, yet he felt strangely out of place among the flags and cheers. His rifle had been turned in, his uniform neatly folded. The world expected him to forget. But every night, as the factory whistles blew and lights dimmed, his hands remembered the chill of the rifle steel and the quiet click of the reversed sight. He returned to his old job at the machine shop in Dayton, where the hum of lathes and the hiss of steam greeted him like old companions. One evening, while adjusting a broken drill press, he noticed the calibration marks were slightly off. He smiled faintly, just enough to remember the Ardennes. The other workers called him Sergeant Straight Eye, not knowing why he chuckled whenever they said it. Some years later, a military researcher from Aberdeen Proving Ground visited, tracing wartime reports of unorthodox methods. The researcher found Hanley behind a workbench, oil-stained and calm. When asked about the backward sight, Hanley simply shrugged. "It was dark," he said. "You learn to trust what feels right." That was all. The researcher left with a note of admiration but no headline. The official archives mentioned nothing more. No medals, no commendations, no textbook acknowledgement. Yet, across Europe, hundreds of soldiers survived night battles because of the quiet adaptation his unit spread. The statistics are scattered but telling. Reduced ammunition waste by 1/3, increased hit probability by nearly half. Small numbers that, multiplied across divisions, meant thousands of lives spared. In 1962, when Hanley's son asked about the war for a school project, the old sergeant took a deep breath and handed him a worn M1 sight wrapped in cloth. "This," he said, "isn't about shooting straighter. It's about thinking differently." The boy didn't understand then, but years later he would. At reunions, when veterans reminisced about their campaigns, someone always brought up that fellow who aimed wrong and hit right. The others would laugh softly, not mockery, but reverence. For them, the story wasn't about marksmanship. It was about courage, the kind that defies manuals. As the decades passed and his hair turned silver, Hanley stopped talking about the war. But on quiet nights, when the wind rustled through the trees outside his small Ohio home, he would sometimes lift an invisible rifle, steady his breath, and whisper, "Backwards again." Because some truths are best seen only in the dark. History rarely records the men who change it by accident. Sergeant William Hanley never imagined his small reversal on a rifle sight would echo through decades of warfare and thought. Yet it did. Not in manuals or medals, but in the quiet way soldiers later adjusted their aim under the night sky, trusting what they felt rather than what they were told. His story lingers because it reveals something deeper than a tactical success. It exposes the thin line between error and insight, between obedience and understanding. In the years after the war, armies invested millions in night vision optics, infrared scopes, and laser-guided systems. But none of those inventions carried the same poetic truth as Hanley's backward sight. It was born not from laboratories, but from exhaustion, fear, and intuition, the purest kind of human intelligence. That moment, when he flipped the sight and hit the target, became a symbol of how progress often hides in imperfection. Every generation of soldiers since has faced its own darkness, literal or moral, and the lesson remains. Sometimes clarity comes not from brighter light, but from accepting the limits of vision and daring to adjust. Hanley's life reminds us that history is not only shaped by those who command, but also by those who quietly see the world differently. In a world built on machinery and precision, it is still the human pulse that guides the line between survival and meaning. A backward glance, a reversed setting, a small act of faith. These are the true instruments of discovery. And so, as the night closes over battlefields long silent, one image remains: a tired man in a frozen field, turning his sight the wrong way, and seeing the world, for once, exactly right.